If you agree that the quietest heroes often carry the loudest courage, make sure to like and subscribe, because this story is one you won't forget. She wasn't a soldier in anyone's eyes, not the kind who wore medals or marched in parades, but she carried paint-stained hands and an eye for detail sharper than a rifle scope. They called her the girl with the spray cans, a civilian in coveralls working at the edge of a military motor pool, where armored personnel carriers rolled in battered and rolled out wearing new skins of camouflage. Most saw nothing but paint and sweat, but the majors saw more, and one night, under the humming floodlights and the sting of solvent in the air, he would remind her who she really was. To the rest of the base, she was simply another contractor in her late 20s, a woman who kept to herself, who spoke little and worked hard, steady as a metronome, invisible in her consistency. They'd see her hunched over steel hulls with her mask on, airbrush hissing as desert beige flowed into green, green into black, the sharp edges of color breaking apart a silhouette that once screamed "Target" and now whispered "Phantom." Her co-workers joked that she could paint leaves on a wall so real they'd rustle in the wind. She would laugh it off, wipe her hands on a rag, and retreat into silence again. But inside, she knew it wasn't just talent. It was training. It was instinct. It was muscle memory from a life she'd promised herself was gone forever. Her name, the one she signed on time sheets and supply requests, belonged to the quiet girl in the coveralls. The other name, the one etched into a file that didn't officially exist, was something else. Shadow Lynx. Her story began long before the motor pool, before the spray guns and solvents, before the camouflage stencils that turned war machines into ghosts of the terrain. She was the daughter of a mechanic in a town that barely showed up on maps, raised in the smell of gasoline and the constant hum of engines. Her father taught her patience, how to listen to the knock of a piston, how to follow the rattle of a chain until she found its weakness. Her mother taught her color, how every shade carried a story, how a sky was never just blue but 1,000 variations of it, how shadows were just as alive as the light that cast them. Those two have fused into her, machine and color, steel and art. And by the time she was in her early 20s, she wasn't just a girl from nowhere. She was something sharper, something different. She wanted out of that town, out of the cycle of dust and rust. So when the recruiters came looking for something unusual, an artist with precision, an eye for detail sharper than cameras, she said yes before she understood what she was agreeing to. They called it the Ghost Initiative. No uniforms, no parades, no records that anyone would ever find. Just specialists chosen for skills that seemed ordinary until sharpened into weapons. They trained her not to paint for beauty but for deception, not to hide mistakes but to erase shakes entirely. She learned how to move in forests and deserts like a smear of shadow, how to blend into city rubble until even searchlights slipped past her. Her call sign became Shadow Lynx because she was silent, elusive, and patient. But her career ended almost before it began. A shrapnel wound during a classified op left her with a limp that would never fully heal, and the initiative decided she was expendable. They didn't throw her away, not quite. They reassigned her quietly to civilian contracts, tucked her into the corner of the war machine where she couldn't cause waves. And so she found herself here, in coveralls, with her paint and her silence, surrounded by soldiers who barely noticed her. She told herself she didn't mind. She told herself that life was behind her. She told herself the lynx was dead. But shadows don't die. They wait. And on a night heavy with heat, under buzzing lights that made the metal skins of armored carriers glow pale and ghostly, the past came back. She had been working late, headphones dangling around her neck, airbrush whining in a steady rhythm as she layered greens across the sides of an APC. The motor pool was nearly empty, the other contractors gone, their laughter fading into the dark hours ago. She liked the quiet, the solitude, the way the steel beasts seemed to hold their breath under her hand. The stencils shifted under her fingers, edges crisp, patterns precise. Every inch of her focus poured into the illusion of invisibility. And then she heard the boots. Not the casual shuffle of a passing guard, but the measured, deliberate cadence of authority. She didn't look up at first. Officers walked these bays all the time. But then the steps stopped behind her, close enough that she could smell polished leather and aftershave. She pulled down her mask, turning slowly, and there he was, Major Halvorsen, his face a map of scars and command, his eyes fixed on her with a weight that made her chest tighten. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice was low, firm, carrying words that struck like a hammer splitting stone. Shadow Lynx. Mission Greenlight. The air seemed to stop moving. Her throat tightened. No one here knew that name. No one here should have known it. For a moment she thought she had misheard, that fatigue had twisted his words into ghosts of the past. But his gaze didn't waver. He knew. Somehow he knew. And in that instant, the layers she had built, the coveralls, the paint, the quiet invisibility, peeled away like old camouflage under rain. She was 28, a painter in a motor pool. But she was also something more, something the Major was calling back into the world. The airbrush in her hand suddenly felt like a weapon. The shadows on the hull of the APC suddenly looked like an omen. And she knew, with the certainty of instinct, that her life was no longer her own. The Lynx had been called. The mission had begun. The name hung in the air like a flare in darkness, Shadow Lynx. And for the first time in years, she felt the weight of it sink into her bones, sharper than any blade, heavier than any rank. She wanted to laugh, to deny it, to tell the Major he had mistaken her for someone else. But there was no mistake in his eyes, no hesitation in the way he said it. And something inside her, something she thought she had buried under layers of paint and quiet labor, stirred awake. Mission Greenlight, he added, softer now, as though the words themselves were a key sliding into a lock, opening a door she had kept sealed. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the airbrush down, and she realized her breathing had shifted into the same steady rhythm it once carried before an op. She hated that muscle memory still clung to her, hated that her body remembered what her mind had tried to erase. "Sir," she managed, her voice dry as sand, "I think you have the wrong person." But he only tilted his head, his scarred face unreadable, and replied, "You don't think they'd hide you forever, do you? We knew where you were. We've always known." A chill crawled up her spine. All this time, she thought she had disappeared, slipped into anonymity with her coveralls and her paints. Yet someone had been watching, waiting for the moment they would need her again. The Major stepped closer, his tone low, deliberate. "The convoy rolls out in 2 hours. Drones are circling, eyes everywhere. If they spot us, if they know we're coming, it's over before it begins. You made these vehicles ghosts, but we need more than paint. We need you." Her pulse quickened. She wanted to refuse, to walk away, to tell him she wasn't that person anymore. But the Major's words dug at something deeper. The truth that painting camouflage wasn't just work for her. It was instinct, survival, the language her soul spoke. She had always seen patterns others couldn't. She could look at a tree lean and know which shades would fracture its shape. She could watch the angle of the sun and know where a shadow would fall. She could breathe in the dust of a desert and taste the colors that would conceal it. It wasn't art, not really. It was an awareness, a way of vanishing, of making others vanish. That was why they had chosen her for the Ghost Initiative, why she had earned the name Shadow Lynx. Not because she could paint, but because she could disappear and make others disappear with her. And though she had told herself that part of her life was over, here was the Major standing in the motor pool at midnight, telling her otherwise. She wanted to tell him about the limp, about how her legs still ached when the weather turned, how she wasn't as fast, as agile, as she used to be. But even as the thought formed, she remembered the way she'd adapted, the way she'd learned to move differently, slower but quieter, more deliberate. The Lynx hadn't died with the injury. It had simply learned to stalk differently. The Major handed her a folder, unmarked, thin but heavy with implication. She opened it reluctantly, eyes scanning grainy satellite images, drones circling ridges, heat signatures scattered across a valley, enemy patrols threading like ants through canyon paths. The convoy she had just painted was marked with red circles. They would be rolling into the kill zone before dawn. "We don't have stealth drones in the air anymore," the Major said quietly. "Budget cuts, redeployments, it doesn't matter. What we have are your APCs and you." Her throat tightened. The idea was insane. One woman against a net of surveillance that could pin down movements from miles away. But she also knew the truth. Paint was only the first step. Movement was the second. Deception was the third. If she could lead the convoy along the terrain, if she could shape their march into the land itself, they might just slip through unseen. And if she failed, every soldier in those vehicles would be a target, lit up on enemy screens like flares. She felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders, heavier than any rifle, heavier than any metal. The Major seemed to read the conflict in her eyes and said only one thing more. If you walk away, they die. If you walk with me, they live. Decide, Shadow Lynx. For a long moment, she stared at the folder, at the blurred images of heat signatures she had once learned to erase from the other side, and her mind drifted back to training. Nights of crawling through mud so cold it froze in her hair. Mornings of painting entire mock towns until they disappeared into the horizon. Exercises where she and her unit became whispers in the terrain, invisible until they struck. She remembered the faces of those she had trained with, the ones who had vanished into missions never spoken of, the ones who never came back. She remembered the sting of shrapnel, the way the world tilted as medics dragged her out, the shame of being told she was finished. And now, here she was, standing in coveralls with paint under her nails, about to be asked to carry the weight again. She wanted to scream at the Major for pulling her back, for reminding her of what she had lost. But another part of her, the part that still sharpened edges on leaves, the part that still measured shadows without thinking, whispered something else. Maybe she had been waiting for this. Maybe she had been painting these APCs for more than contracts and paychecks. Maybe some part of her knew this night would come. She closed the folder, exhaling slowly, and when she lifted her eyes, the Major didn't press her. He only waited, patient, as if he already knew her answer. 2 hours, she asked finally, her voice steadier than she expected. He nodded once. Then I'll need chalk, maps, and every set of night optics you can spare. He didn't smile, didn't thank her, just gave a curt nod as though her acceptance was inevitable. And in that moment she realized, this wasn't a choice, not really. This was gravity, pulling her back into the orbit she thought she'd escaped. As he left the bay to make preparations, she stood alone by the APC, her reflection faint in the gloss of freshly dried paint, and for the first time in years, she didn't see the girl in coveralls staring back. She saw the Lynx. The minutes ticked like heartbeats as she gathered what she needed. She sketched maps by hand, marking ridgelines and shadows, calculating angles of light from the rising moon, remembering how to read the land like a language. Soldiers began to filter into the bay, loading gear, checking weapons, eyes wary but unaware of her role. To them, she was still the girl with paint on her hands, until the Major spoke a few clipped words, and suddenly she wasn't. Suddenly, she was something else, someone they looked at with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for ghosts. She didn't explain, didn't offer a name. She just worked, laying chalk patterns across the sides of the vehicles, teaching them how to move as one body, how to become shadows within shadows. They listened, because something in her tone carried authority they didn't understand, because she didn't sound like a contractor anymore. She sounded like someone who had been here before, someone who knew the difference between being seen and being alive. And as she walked among the convoy, checking every pattern, every angle, every soldier, the thought pulsed in her mind like a drumbeat. Shadow Lynx had been reborn. The engines rumbled like caged beasts as dawn threatened the horizon, their low growls shivering across the valley floor. But to the soldiers riding inside, everything felt tense, brittle, as though one wrong move would shatter them into flames. She moved along the line of armored carriers, her hand brushing steel like she was calming horses before a charge, checking patterns, adjusting chalk lines, whispering instructions that weren't really about pain anymore, but about survival itself. Stay tight. Shadows overlap. Follow the land, not the road. They listened, not because of her rank. She had none, but because something in her voice carried the weight of survival. A steady certainty that cut through fear. She climbed into the lead vehicle beside the Major, her leg aching from the old wound, but her eyes sharp, scanning the ridges where enemy optics would be watching. The convoy rolled forward, slow and steady, tires crunching on gravel that seemed louder than gunfire in the silence of pre-dawn. Every instinct in her screamed that they were visible, exposed, that any second heat signatures would light up on enemy screens and the valley would erupt in fire. But then the training took over, and she breathed in the rhythm of the terrain, guiding the Major with clipped words. Cut left. Hug the ridge. Slow. Let the shadow cover. From above, on the drone feeds, she could almost picture in her mind The convoy was no longer a line of machines, but a jagged smear of darkness, breaking against the landscape like fragments of rock. The camouflage she had painted was working, but it was movement, her orchestration, that made the difference. Vehicles slipped into gullies, paused in the embrace of cliffs until the timing was right, rolled forward in unison so that patterns overlapped and shapes fractured. She could feel the soldiers inside holding their breath, trusting her, and no fear clawed at her chest. Another part of her thrilled at the precision, at the way the convoy seemed to vanish into the world itself. And then came the first test. A drone buzzed faintly above, its eyes sweeping across the ridgeline, its sensors searching for heat. The major glanced at her, jaw tight, waiting for the inevitable flash of detection. But she leaned out the hatch, studying the angles, and whispered, "Stop! Kill engines." The entire convoy froze. Silence pressed in, suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the drone. It passed overhead, blind, sliding across the valley without pausing, and when its sound faded, engines rumbled to life again. Relief rippled through the men, though no one spoke it. She only nodded once, the lynx inside her prowling fully awake now. As the sun's first light bled across the horizon, their camouflage was tested again and again. Patrols appeared in the distance, silhouettes against the ridges, and each time she guided the convoy into folds of the terrain, angling them so the morning glare masked their outlines. At one point, a pair of enemy trucks rattled across a high pass, close enough that the dust from their tires drifted down into the valley, and still the convoy held still, blending so perfectly into the broken stone that even trained eyes saw nothing but shadows. Her heart hammered with every close call, but with each escape, her confidence grew, not arrogance, but a grim certainty. She wasn't just painting machines anymore. She was painting the battlefield itself, brushstrokes of silence and deception, every move another stroke in a masterpiece of survival. Hours stretched like years, and exhaustion tugged at her bones, but she pushed through, driven by the weight of what failure meant. And then came the hardest trial, the bottleneck. A narrow canyon, open to the sky, unavoidable, with drone feeds certain to sweep across. She studied the maps, the angles, her mind racing. "We can't go through in a line," she muttered. "Too visible. We stagger, one vehicle at a time, at intervals. Move like shadows breaking apart, not a column." The major trusted her, gave the order, and the convoy splintered, crawling through the canyon in ragged pulses. It was agony, every second stretched thin, every rumble of an engine threatening to betray them. But as the last APC cleared the canyon, still unseen, she allowed herself the smallest breath of relief. She glanced at the major, and for the first time, his hard face softened, his eyes carrying something like respect. But the mission wasn't over. As they approached the valley's far edge, enemy units began to stir, unaware yet but restless, and the convoy had one last gauntlet to cross. Open ground where no camouflage could fully conceal them. She knew this was the moment, the one that would decide everything. She climbed down from the vehicle, chalk in hand, moving swiftly across the line, scrawling new patterns, breaking edges further, smearing dust by hand across steel until machines looked like fragments of Earth itself. The soldiers watched her, silent, as if sensing the ritual mattered more than reason, as if believing in her was the only thing keeping them invisible. When she climbed back up, her hands raw, she whispered, "Now." Engines growled. The convoy pushed forward, and she prayed to every god she didn't believe in that it would be enough. The drones returned, sweeping like vultures, their sensors hungry. For a heartbeat, she thought they were caught, that the mission would end in fire. But then the feeds, if anyone was watching them, would have seen nothing more than broken terrain, shapes that belonged, shadows in motion. The convoy slipped across the open ground like smoke, untouchable, and then they were through. The valley behind them, the horizon opening wide, the mission alive. Inside the lead vehicle, silence cracked into something else, a roar of relief, of disbelief. Soldiers clapped one another, laughter spilling into the air like it had been trapped too long. The major didn't join them. He only looked at her, long and steady, and gave a single nod, the kind of gesture that carried more weight than any medal. She sat back, exhaustion flooding her, paint still staining her hands, And for the first time in years, she felt whole. Not a forgotten contractor, not a girl in coveralls, not just the one with the spray cans. She was Shadow Lynx, reborn, not because she chose it, but because it was who she had always been. And as the convoy rolled safely toward its destination, she realized something else. The Lynx was never about missions or code names. It was about seeing what others couldn't, about protecting those who couldn't see for themselves. That was her gift. That was her curse. That was her truth. The Major broke the silence at last, his voice low but steady. You saved them. You saved us all. She met his eyes, weary but unflinching, and replied only with a whisper. No, the shadows did. And in that moment, the legend of Shadow Lynx lived again.